The orders arrived wrapped in a shroud of secrecy, a summons that promised not glory, but a grim and likely final flight into the heart of the enemy's domain. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a man whose very name was synonymous with aeronautical daring, stood in a sterile briefing room, the air thick with the scent of stale coffee and impending history. Before him, a handful of senior officers laid out the audacious plan to launch 16 land-based B-25 Mitchell bombers from the heaving deck of an aircraft carrier, strike the Japanese mainland, and then fly on, with nowhere to land, into the vast and uncertain expanse of China. It was a mission born of desperation and a burning need for retribution. After the devastation of Pearl Harbor, a one-way ticket into the pages of history for the men who dared to volunteer. Doolittle's jaw was set, his eyes reflecting a cold, calculating fire. He understood the staggering risks better than anyone. The physics-defying takeoff, the relentless flight over hostile waters, the razor-thin fuel margins, the near certainty of capture or death. Yet, within him burned an unshakable resolve, a conviction that this symbolic blow was a necessary poison to inject into the enemy's psyche. He would not ask any man to do what he himself would not do first. He would lead this mission from the cockpit of the very first bomber. The call went out for volunteers for an extremely hazardous mission. No details were given, only the ominous warning of extreme danger. They came anyway, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners, young men with weathered faces and steady hands, drawn by the quiet authority in Doolittle's reputation and the unspoken promise of striking back. Among them was Lieutenant Ted Lawson, a pilot with a calm demeanor that belied a fierce competitive spirit. He stood with his crew, their postures a mix of eager anticipation and sober contemplation, as they filed into the hangar where Doolittle waited. The cavernous space echoed with the weight of the moment. Doolittle stood before them, not on a podium, but on their level, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the 80 men who would become his raiders. He laid it out with brutal, soldierly honesty. He described the mission's objective, the unprecedented carrier launch, and the chilling reality that there would be no return to the Hornet. They would bomb Japan and then fly until their fuel ran out, ditching at sea or bailing out over a foreign land. Survival was not a parameter of the mission's success. The strike itself was the only objective. A profound silence fell over the hangar, broken only by the distant hum of base activity. The thematic weight of duty versus survival settled upon each man like a physical burden. They were being asked to trade their futures for a principle, to become a message written in fire and delivered from the sky. Ted Lawson felt the gravity of it, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. But he also felt the pull of something greater than himself. He looked at his crew, at the determined set of their jaws, and knew his answer was already written. There was no hesitation, only a grim acceptance. One by one, without a word of dissent, they volunteered, their silent commitment forging a bond that would carry them across the Pacific and into the annals of legend. The call to arms had been answered. The USS Hornet, a steel leviathan of the Pacific, cut through the gray waters of San Francisco Bay with a purpose known only to a select few. Lashed to her flight deck in 2 precise rows were 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers, their presence a bizarre and impossible sight. The twin-engine land-based planes looked like captive giants, their wings stretching so far they overhung the deck's edges, their propellers stilled and waiting. They were not the Hornet's natural children. They were a dangerous, unprecedented cargo, a secret so vast it seemed to strain the very seams of the great ship. Life aboard the carrier settled into a new, strange rhythm. The airmen, accustomed to the sprawling runways of airfields, now navigated the cramped steel passageways of a world constantly in motion. The steady, deep-throated thrum of the ship's engines became the soundtrack to their days, a vibration they felt in their bones. The scent of salt spray, oil, and fresh paint mingled in the confined spaces. They learned the subtle language of a ship at sea, the gentle roll, the sudden pitch, the way a coffee cup would slide across a mess table without warning. Camaraderie was forged in these close quarters, a necessary bond against the shared, unspoken anxiety. Men played cards in dimly lit compartments, their laughter a little too loud, their focus a little too intense. They shared photographs of wives and sweethearts, the images worn soft at the edges from constant handling, each one a silent anchor to a world they might never see again. On the deck, under the watchful eyes of the Hornet's crew, they practiced the mission's most critical maneuver, the short takeoff. With the bomber's tails hanging precariously over the stern, they ran their engines to a deafening roar, their wheels chocked and ropes straining, simulating the desperate sprint they would need to become airborne. It was a terrifying ballet of power and precision, a dance with physics where a single misstep meant a plunge into the cold, waiting sea. Pilots like Ted Lawson would sit in their cockpits, hands gripping the controls, feeling the massive airframe shudder and buck against its restraints, mentally measuring the impossibly short strip of deck ahead. Through it all moved the steadying presence of Jimmy Doolittle. He was a constant figure on the flight deck, a colonel who looked more like a seasoned engineer in his leather jacket. His eyes missed nothing. He would run a hand along a wing seam, peer into an engine cowling, or discuss fuel mixture settings with a nervous crew chief. His inspections were not those of a distant commander, but of a fellow airman who would be leading the way. He moved among the men, his calm, authoritative demeanor a bulwark against the rising tide of fear. He found a young gunner staring out at the endless expanse of water, his face pale. Doolittle stood beside him for a long moment, not speaking, just sharing the view. Then he placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder, a simple, wordless gesture that conveyed more reassurance than any speech could. He was not just their leader. He was their guarantee that the impossible had been considered, calculated, and could be conquered. The Hornet steamed west, a city of steel carrying its secret towards the dawn. Every man aboard a thread in the fabric of a daring, desperate gamble. The vast, empty expanse of the Pacific became a theater of taut nerves and unblinking eyes. The Hornet, now joined by Admiral Halsey's flagship Enterprise, and her protective screen of cruisers and destroyers, plowed through the swells in a formation of grim purpose. The initial novelty of the sea voyage had long since evaporated, replaced by a pervasive grinding tension that settled over the task force like a fog. Every man who could be spared was pressed into service as a lookout, their eyes perpetually scanning the shimmering gray horizon for the faintest smudge of smoke or the telltale glint of sunlight on a distant hull. The sea and sky, once symbols of boundless freedom, were now a domain of potential threat, every whitecap a phantom periscope, every cloud bank a hiding place for enemy aircraft. Days bled into one another, marked only by the changing of the watch and the slow, steady tick of the chronometers toward the launch point. The air crews went through their final drills with a quiet intensity, their movements practiced to the point of instinct. They studied their maps until the paper grew soft, memorizing every twist of the Chinese coastline, every potential landing field that might mean the difference between capture and a slim chance of survival. In the ready rooms and mess decks, the silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rustle of charts and the low murmur of technical discussions about fuel consumption and engine performance. The weight of the unknown pressed down upon them, a palpable force that made sleep elusive and food taste like ash. Then, on the morning they had all been dreading and anticipating, the cry came from the crow's nest. A small vessel, a Japanese picket boat, was sighted on the horizon, its profile a stark, menacing slash against the endless blue. Alarm klaxons shattered the tense silence, their wails sending a jolt of pure adrenaline through the entire ship. Sailors scrambled to battle stations, the thunder of heavy guns being trained, echoing through the steel decks. The tiny boat was quickly obliterated by the task force's guns, but the damage was done. The element of surprise, that most precious and fragile of military commodities, had been shattered. The Hornet had been seen. On the bridge, a hurried, urgent conference took place between Doolittle and Admiral Halsey. The original plan, a carefully calculated launch under the cover of evening darkness, was now untenable. The picket boat would have radioed a warning. The Japanese homeland would now be stirring, its defenses rousing. To wait was to sail into a prepared hornet's nest. The decision was made with a soldier's brutal calculus. They would launch now, hours early, hundreds of miles farther from Japan than planned. It was a desperate gamble that turned an already perilous mission into a near-suicidal one, slashing their already thin fuel margins to the bone. The order flashed through the ship. "Army pilots, man your planes." The effect was electric. The deliberate, methodical pace of the past days exploded into a frenzy of controlled chaos. Crews poured onto the flight deck, a river of men in leather jackets and flight caps, sprinting toward their waiting bombers. The deck, once a place of quiet practice, was now a cacophony of roaring engines, shouted commands, and the frantic activity of arming crews loading bombs into bays. The wind, whipped by the carrier's speed, tore at their clothing as they worked, heaving heavy ordnance into bellies and checking last-minute connections with frantic, practiced hands. The sea around them churned, green and angry, the Hornet's bow rising and falling in the heavy swells, a stark reminder of the impossible takeoff that now awaited them, hours ahead of schedule. The unpredictability of war had asserted itself, forcing their hand and hurtling them all toward a destiny that was now hurtling toward them just as fast. The flight deck of the USS Hornet was a scene of controlled pandemonium, a stage set for an act of aviation that defied all precedent. A cold, stinging salt spray whipped across the heaving deck, soaking the crews as they swarmed over the 16 B-25 Mitchells. The great ship carved through towering Pacific swells, her bow rising high on a crest before plunging into a deep trough, sending shuddering vibrations through the steel beneath their feet. The ocean was not a runway. It was a bucking, unpredictable beast, and they were tasked with taming it for a few precious seconds. At the very front of the line, lashed down but straining like a hound at the leash, was Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's plane, its engines already turning over with a low, guttural growl that promised thunder. Doolittle stood by his cockpit, a figure of preternatural calm in the maelstrom. His eyes scanned the chaotic deck, the frantic sailors painting a white line along the dangerously short takeoff run, the crew chiefs giving last-minute thumbs up to their pilots. He exchanged a final firm nod with the Hornet's flight deck officer, a silent transfer of responsibility. The fate of the mission, of every man and every plane, now rested on the next few minutes. He climbed into his seat, the familiar confines of the cockpit, a small island of order. His hands moved over the controls with a mechanic's certainty, priming, checking and confirming. Outside, his crew secured the hatch, their faces grim and resolute. There were no more words, only the building roar of the twin Wright Cyclone engines as they were pushed to a deafening, ear-splitting crescendo. The entire airframe shuddered violently, the brakes holding the beast back as the propellers became invisible blurs, tearing the salt-laden air to shreds. A green flag swept down from the flight deck officer. It was the signal. The chocks were pulled. For a heart-stopping moment, Doolittle's B-25 seemed to sag, its weight fully on its wheels. Then it began to roll, lumbering forward like a great, ungainly bird, unsure of its own power. It accelerated with agonizing slowness, the deck streaming past in a blur of gray. The bow of the Hornet was rising, then suddenly it dropped away into a yawning. For a terrifying second, it seemed the plane would simply roll off the end and plunge into the churning sea. But Doolittle held it down, gathering every ounce of speed, and, as the bow began its next upward climb, he hauled back on the yoke. The bomber's nose lifted, its wheels skimmed the very edge of the deck, and then it was free, clawing its way into the leaden sky. A massive, improbable silhouette against the roiling clouds. A collective, held breath was released across the deck, a silent, shared exhalation of awe and relief. The first was away. Now, the real test began. One by one, the other bombers followed, each take off a unique and harrowing drama. Ted Lawson watched from his cockpit, his knuckles white on the controls, as the plane ahead of him fought for the sky. He saw its wheels clear the deck by what looked like inches, the bomber sinking alarmingly before its wings bit into the air, and it began a slow, laboring climb. Then, it was his turn. The green flag dropped. He pushed the throttles forward, feeling the raw power surge through the airframe. The deck rushed beneath him, a short, slick ribbon of steel. He felt the sickening drop of the bow, fought the urge to pull up too soon, and then, at the precise moment, he pulled back. His plane leaped from the deck, a sudden, weightless freedom followed by the gut-wrenching sensation of a stall. For a heart-stopping eternity they hung there, before the airspeed built, and they climbed, joining the circling formation above. Below, the spectacle continued. Each B-25 roared down the deck, engines screaming in protest, decks heaving beneath them. One plane dipped its wing perilously close to a wave top after becoming airborne, a moment of sheer terror for its crew before the pilot regained control. Another seemed to hang on the propellers alone, clawing for altitude with desperate determination. But one by one, they all made it. The last bomber became a speck in the sky, its engine noise fading into the wind. An immense emotional relief washed over the men on the Hornet's deck. A profound, almost spiritual release from the unbearable tension. They had done it. All 16 were airborne. But for the air crews, climbing into the gloomy overcast, the relief was fleeting, instantly replaced by a cold, sobering dread. They were in the air, yes, but they were now profoundly alone. Behind them, the task force was already turning away, a shrinking haven on the vast ocean. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of hostile water, an enemy coast bristling with defenses, and a flight to China that now seemed impossibly long due to their premature launch. They had conquered the deck, but the ocean stretched before them, an endless, gray desert, and their fuel gauges already told a story of a journey with a desperately uncertain end. The world shrank to a narrow, desperate band of air just above the churning whitecaps. Once airborne, the 16 B-25s did not climb for the safety of altitude, but instead descended, pushing their noses down until it felt as though the propellers themselves were combing the foam from the waves. They flew so low that the salty spray from the ocean's surface misted their windshields, and the roar of their engines was swallowed by the vast, monotonous groan of the sea. This was their only shield, their fragile cloak of invisibility. To fly any higher was to risk detection by Japanese patrols or radar, to become a slow, lumbering target in an empty sky. So they skimmed the waves, their shadows racing across the water beneath them like dark, frantic spirits. Inside the cramped, vibrating cockpits, the atmosphere was one of intense, focused concentration. The pilots' hands were locked on the yokes, their bodies tensed against the constant, subtle corrections needed to maintain their perilous altitude. A moment's inattention, a rogue gust of wind, and a wingtip could dig into a swell, spelling an instantaneous, watery end. The navigators were the mission's unsung psychics, hunched over their charts in the dim light, with no radio beacons to guide them and no landmarks on the featureless expanse. They relied on the ancient art of dead reckoning. They plotted their course using airspeed, compass headings, and estimated wind drift, their calculations a delicate house of cards built on guesswork and hope. They marked their progress with sharp pencils, each tiny tick on the chart a testament to their faith in numbers and the steady thrum of the engines. It was the fuel, however, that was the true enemy. A silent, ticking clock in every cockpit. The early launch had stolen precious gallons, turning a tight margin into a desperate race. The engineers monitored the gauges with a hawk-like intensity, their minds constantly performing the grim arithmetic of consumption versus distance. The numbers did not add up. The comforting safety margin they had briefed on the Hornet had evaporated, replaced by a chilling certainty that they would be running on fumes long before they saw the friendly coast of China. The thematic element of precision became a matter of life and death. A few degrees off course, a few minutes too long at a rich fuel mixture, and the mission would end not in triumph, but in a silent, lonely descent into the sea. In one plane, the tension boiled over into a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. The navigator, his face pale and slick with sweat under his oxygen mask, rechecked his figures for the 10th time. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized a catastrophic error, a miscalculated wind correction factor that had been sending them subtly off course for nearly an hour. He scrambled forward, tapping the pilot frantically on the shoulder and thrusting the forward chart and his sextant readings toward him. A frantic, silent conference ensued in the cockpit, hands pointing, head shaking. For several long minutes, a cold dread gripped the entire crew. They were lost, bleeding fuel into a navigational void. The pilot's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking from the compass to the endless water and back to the terrified navigator. He made a swift, decisive correction, turning the plane onto a new heading. The navigator, shamed and shaken, returned to his station and recalculated, his hands trembling. The brief panic subsided, leaving behind a residue of cold sweat and the sobering realization that their survival hinged on the flawless execution of every single task, and that even the smallest human error could be their doom. The looming fuel crisis was no longer an abstract concept. It was a specter riding in the cockpit, with them, its breath growing colder with every gallon that bled from the tanks. A thin, dark smudge broke the endless, hypnotic monotony of the sea. It was no cloud, no trick of the light or weary eyes. It was land, Japan. The sight sent a jolt of pure, undiluted adrenaline through every man and every plane, a current that snapped them from the long, low-level trance of the ocean flight. The sprawling industrial coastline materialized with unnerving speed, a jagged line of reality separating the gray water from a hazy green and brown interior. The mission, until now a theoretical exercise in navigation and fuel management, was suddenly terrifyingly real. The abstract had become concrete. The map had become a target. Inside the bombers, a new kind of focus descended, sharp and cold. The gunners, who had spent hours staring at empty skies, now swung their .50 caliber machine guns with a fresh, deadly purpose. They checked and rechecked their weapons, the heavy bolts sliding back and forth with a well-oiled clatter that was both reassuring and grim. They scanned the sky above the coastline, their eyes searching for the telltale specks of enemy fighters, or the sudden black puffs of flak that would blossom like poisonous flowers. The bombardiers, the men whose single action would define the entire audacious venture, became the focal points of their crews. They moved to their stations, in the plexiglass noses of the B-25s, their bodies curling into the familiar cramped position. With meticulous, deliberate movements, they began the final arming sequence. Safety pins were pulled from heavy, high-explosive bombs. Their dull, olive-drab casings now live and waiting. The bomb bay doors groaned open, letting a rush of cold, foreign air scream into the fuselage, carrying with it the faint, alien scent of wood smoke and earth. In one plane, the co-pilot, a young man from the flat, endless plains of Kansas, found his gaze locked on the approaching land. The sprawling cities in the distance, Tokyo, Yokohama, were not just clusters of buildings on a map anymore. They were living, breathing entities, symbols of the enemy's industrial and military might that had struck Pearl Harbor and swept across the Pacific. He saw the geometric patterns of roads and railways, the faint plumes of factory smoke staining the sky, and his mind recoiled from the impending reality. He was not a sack philosopher, just a man who had joined the fly, but in that moment, he grappled with the mission's stark morality. He was about to rain destruction down on homes, on streets where people lived, on a nation going about its day, utterly unaware of the 16 angels of death approaching from the sea. The distant urban landscapes were no longer abstract symbols. They were a tapestry of human life, and he was a thread about to be pulled, unraveling a small part of it in fire and shrapnel. It was a heavy, silent burden, this knowledge of the chaos they were bringing, a stark counterpoint to the surge of battle-ready focus that filled the cockpit. The adrenaline was there, yes, but so was the chilling weight of the deed, a duality that would forever mark the moment they crossed from the open ocean onto the soil of their enemy. The first puffs of black smoke blossomed in the air ahead, innocuous as dandelion spores, before the sharp, flat crack of the explosions reached them. Tokyo's sky, a pale, hazy blue, was no longer empty. Doolittle's B-25, the lead aircraft, held its nerve-shattering low-level course, weaving through the industrial outskirts of the city. The light anti-aircraft fire was sporadic at first, a nervous, probing defense from gunners caught completely by surprise. Tracers, lazy and orange in the daylight, arced up in graceful, misplaced curves, the gunners misjudging the bomber's terrifying speed and impossibly low altitude. The plane shuddered as it punched through the concussive waves of the nearer bursts, the sound of physical blow against the thin aluminum skin. Inside, the world narrowed to the view through the windshield, a rushing panorama of factory roofs, railway yards, and the winding reflective ribbon of a river, all framed by the sudden ugly flowers of flak. The bomb run was a study in cold mechanical precision, Doolittle's voice, calm and measured, cut through the interphone, a steady anchor in the storm. The bombardier, curled in the plexiglass nose, had become an extension of the Norden sight, his world reduced to crosshairs in the approaching target. His breathing was slow, controlled, his finger resting lightly on the toggle switch. The cityscape streamed beneath them, a dizzying blur of gray and brown. Then the target, a sprawling complex of workshops and power substations, slid into the crosshairs. A final, silent calculation, a whispered count, and his thumb pressed down. A deep, metallic thud resonated through the airframe as the first bomb fell away. The plane, lurching upward, suddenly lighter. A second followed, then a third and fourth, each release a jolt of relief and a surge of grim finality. The bombs fell in a short, tight string, their descent a silent, deadly promise. For a few heartbeats, there was nothing but the roar of their engines and the continued ineffectual flak. Then, the world below erupted. A primary explosion, a brilliant sun-bright flash of orange and white, swallowed a large warehouse hole. It was followed instantly by a secondary, larger detonation that tore through an adjacent structure, sending a fireball roiling hundreds of feet into the air, a swirling vortex of black smoke and crimson flame. The concussion slammed into the B-25, buffeting it like a toy. More explosions bloomed in their wake, a rapid, staccato rhythm of destruction, as the other planes in their element began their own runs. Industrial Tokyo was being methodically torn apart, the careful geometry of its streets and buildings dissolving into chaos. In the rear of the plane, a young gunner, his face pressed against the cold glass of his blister window, witnessed the impact. His job was to watch the sky, but his eyes were dragged downward, mesmerized and horrified by the tableau of devastation unfolding below. He saw the firestorm they had ignited begin to spread, a living, hungry thing, consuming everything in its path. He saw tiny, ant-like figures scrambling amidst the inferno. The human cost of their clinical strike made terrifyingly clear. This was not a training exercise over a barren range. This was a city. He saw a tram, a minute speck from this height, stopped on a street as flames licked at its sides, and his mind, unbidden, populated it with people. He saw the roofs of smaller, flimsier buildings' homes, perhaps succumb to the encroaching fire, collapsing inwards with silent, awful finality. He was elated that they had hit their target, that the mission was a success. But a cold, sickening feeling coiled in his gut. He was grappling with the visceral reality of war, the disconnect between the strategic objective and the raw, human suffering now blooming in the fires below. He had helped deliver this hell, and the image of those distant, frantic figures would be seared into his memory, long after the flak had faded and the last of their fuel was gone. A permanent, haunting scar from the day they painted Tokyo's sky with fire. The chaos Doolittle had ignited was only the beginning. As his plane banked away, trailing the scent of cordite and smoke, the other B-25s descended upon Tokyo like a swarm of vengeful hornets. The city, caught in the complacency of a quiet afternoon, erupted into a sprawling panorama of panic. From 1,000 feet, the urban landscape became a living map of terror. Ant-like figures scrambled through streets that moments before had been orderly and calm. The initial isolated fires from Doolittle's strike began to merge, fanned by a capricious wind, growing into a single, roaring beast that fed on wood and paper houses. Thick, black smoke churned into the sky, a towering pyre visible for miles, its underbelly glowing a hellish orange from the inferno below. The air itself seemed to tremble, not just from the concussions of falling bombs, but from the collective shock of a people who had believed their homeland inviolable. One particular B-25, piloted by a young lieutenant from Ohio, finished its bomb run over a warehouse district along the Sumida River. As it pulled up, its crew felt a surge of grim accomplishment, watching their explosives walk a line of devastation through a factory complex. But their relief was short-lived. A sleek, dark shape dropped from the sun-dazzled haze above, its wings adorned with the red circle of the rising sun. A Japanese Zero, its engine screaming in a higher, more aggressive pitch than their own, dove upon them with lethal intent. Tracers, now frighteningly accurate, stitched a line of glowing holes across their starboard wing. The American pilot reacted not with panic, but with a cool, instinctual skill born of countless training hours. He shoved the yoke forward, throwing the heavy bomber into a gut-wrenching dive toward the labyrinth of the city below. They skimmed over rooftops so low the crew could see the terrified, upturned faces of people in the streets. The Zero, built for high-altitude agility, was momentarily wrong-footed, its pilot unwilling to follow into the treacherous terrain of telegraph wires and factory chimneys. The American pilot hauled back on the controls, using a rising thermal from a burning block to gain a precious few feet of altitude, then banked sharply around a tall smokestack, using it as a momentary shield. The Zero pilot, enraged and determined, tried to cut inside the turn, but the B-25's gunners found their mark. The top turret and the waist gunner opened up simultaneously, their twin streams of .50 caliber fire converging on the fighter's engine. A puff of black smoke, then a trail of flame, and the Zero nosed down, disappearing into the conflagration it had been tasked to prevent. It was a moment of pure, desperate luck, wedded to unflinching resolve, a microcosm of the entire raid's audacious spirit. The thematic contrast was stark and brutal. Inside the bombers, the mood was one of fierce, focused determination. Each near miss, each evaded fighter, each successfully dropped bomb was a small victory in a seemingly impossible task. They were the instruments of a nation's rage, their resolve hardened by the memory of Pearl Harbor. Below, the Japanese experienced a profound and disorienting shock. The wail of air raid sirens, a sound many heard for the first time, was a psychological blow as powerful as any bomb. The sight of the giant, twin-tailed bombers, a plane never meant to be seen over their capital, shattered the myth of impregnability. The American resolve, forged in the fires of revenge, met the Japanese shock, born of violated sovereignty, over the burning heart of Tokyo, creating a new, terrifying reality for both nations in the smoke-filled sky. The chaos was not confined to Tokyo. As the trailing elements of Doolittle's force swept over the coastline, their assigned targets lay further south, in the great port cities of Yokohama and Kobe. These urban centers, vital arteries of the Japanese Empire's industrial and maritime might, were stirring to a belated and furious life. The distant pillars of smoke rising from Tokyo were a grim warning that had traveled faster than the bombers themselves. By the time the B-25s approached Yokohama's sprawling dockyards and Kobe's dense industrial zones, the sky was no longer a place of surprise, but a killing field. The initial sporadic flak they had encountered over the capital was here replaced by a coordinated, concentrated wall of fire. The air thickened with the black, greasy puffs of exploding shells, a forest of sudden, lethal blossoms that filled the sky with shrapnel and concussive fury. One particular bomber, its fuselage already scarred by near misses over the capital, pressed on toward its target in Kobe. The crew, their faces set in masks of grim concentration, could feel the plane shudder as it flew through the turbulent, shredded air left by the flak bursts. The pilot, a man whose hands had been steady through the terrifying takeoff and the long overwater flight, now wrestled with the yoke as if it were a living thing, jinking and weaving through the worst of the fire. The randomness of survival became a tangible force in the cockpit. A shell burst to the left, then one to the right, each one close enough to pepper the aluminum skin with holes and rattle their teeth. It was a macabre lottery, and their number had not yet been called. They could see other bombers in the distance, some trailing smoke, one spiraling downward in a final fatal dive, a stark reminder that their own continued flight was a temporary, fragile gift. Then, the lottery almost ended. A flak burst, larger and closer than any before, erupted directly in their flight path. There was no time to turn, no time to climb or dive. The world outside the windshield vanished in a sudden, blinding flash of orange and black. The concussion hit them like a physical hammer, slamming the plane sideways and upward with brutal, indiscriminate force. The sound was a deafening roar that swallowed the engine noise whole. For a terrifying second, control was lost. The B-25 wallowed, a leaf in a hurricane, its instruments spinning wildly. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage with a sound like tearing canvas, and a frigid gale screamed through the new holes. The co-pilot, thrown hard against his harness, saw a jagged piece of steel embedded in the bulkhead inches from his head, its edges still glowing with heat. The pilot's response was pure, adrenalized instinct. He did not try to regain their original course or altitude. Instead, he shoved the yoke forward and stood on the right rudder, throwing the wounded bomber into a violent descending turn toward the city itself. It was a desperate, risky maneuver, a dive into the urban canyons where the heavy anti-aircraft guns could not depress their barrels to follow. They fell out of the sky, the altimeter unwinding in a frantic spin, the cityscape rushing up to meet them in a dizzying blur of rooftops and streets. They were trading the random death of the flak-filled sky for the deliberate danger of flying at treetop level through a waking hostile city. The crew, strapped into their stations, could only watch as telephone wires and church steeples flashed past their windows, their survival now hinging on their pilot's skill and the sheer dumb luck of an empty street at the end of their dive. The duty that had carried them across the ocean now demanded this final, terrifying gamble, a stark testament to the fact that in war, survival was often less a matter of planning than a brutal random dance with fate. The last bombs fell away, their destructive work complete, and a profound, hollow silence seemed to fill the bellies of the B-25s. The roaring infernos of Tokyo, Yokohama, and Kobe fell behind them, shrinking in their rearview windows into distant, glowing scars on the face of Japan. But the relief of a successful strike was instantly crushed by a more immediate, more intimate terror. The fuel gauges, the needles, which had been hovering at the edge of the acceptable for hours, now dipped decisively into the red, a silent, screaming confirmation of their worst fears. The mission was over. The true fight for survival had just begun. There was no home to return to, no friendly carrier waiting on the waves. Their only hope lay across 600 miles of the East China Sea, in the fog-shrouded mountainous coast of a China they hoped was still free. Inside the vibrating, battle-scarred fuselages, the navigators became the most important men alive. They spread their charts across their knees once more, but these were different maps now. Their pencils, blunted from hours of use, traced new, desperate routes. They calculated headings, not for bomb runs, but for the faint hope of a friendly reception. They searched their charts for any marked airfield, any stretch of beach long enough for a crash landing, any patch of flat ground where a parachute descent might not end on a jagged peak or in a Japanese-controlled village. The hope for friendly skies was a fragile prayer whispered over the constant drone of the engines. A prayer that the Chinese on the coast would hear the unfamiliar roar of their engines and see allies, not another wave of invaders. Every mile flown was a mile deeper into the unknown, a gamble with their last precious drops of fuel as the ante. Then, a voice crackled over the radio, cutting through the static and the low thrum of anxiety. It was Doolittle. His tone was not that of a commander delivering orders, but of a fellow airman sharing a grim reality. He acknowledged their success, the stunning blow they had struck against the heart of the enemy, but he did not linger on the past. His words were forward-looking, pragmatic, and infused with a steely calm that seeped into the cockpits of the 15 other bombers. He spoke of the challenge ahead, not as a death sentence, but as the final, critical phase of their mission. He reminded them of their training, of the procedures for ditching at sea, for bailing out over land. He spoke of the Chinese people, of the partisans and farmers who would be their best chance for survival. There was no false optimism in his voice, only a bedrock of unwavering confidence in their ability to see this through. His leadership, which had been a physical presence on the Hornet's deck, now became a disembodied beacon of morale, a steady hand on the collective shoulder of 80 men flying into the deepening twilight. He was leading them still, not with a plane to follow, but with a spirit to emulate, turning their desperate flight away from Japan into a purposeful, if perilous, turn for home. The final, grim arithmetic of the mission was being tallied not on paper, but on the glass faces of the fuel gauges. The needles, once hovering with deceptive steadiness, now trembled on their pins, their tips buried deep in the red arcs marked empty. The sight was a cold, jamb, empty. The sight was a cold, silent verdict in every cockpit. The triumph of the bombing runs, the adrenaline of evading flak and fighters, all of it faded into insignificance before this simple mechanical truth. They were not going to make it to the designated friendly airfields in China. The dream of a safe landing, of taxiing to a stop on solid ground, evaporated like the last vapors of fuel in their lines. The mission was over. The aftermath was beginning, and it promised to be as perilous as anything they had yet faced. A new, frantic energy took hold of the crews, a controlled desperation that replaced the focused calm of the bomb run. Gunners began the grim task of jettisoning their heavy machine guns, heaving the once prized weapons out of the waste windows and into the churning sea below, a sacrifice to save precious pounds of weight. Any remaining ammunition followed, clattering into the void. The empty bomb bays, which had once held the purpose of their entire journey, gaped open like wounds, letting in the frigid, high-altitude air. Pilots reduced power, leaning out their fuel mixtures to anemic whispers, coaxing every possible mile from the dying engines. The great bombers, once roaring beasts of war, became gliders, their flight a slow, sinking surrender to gravity. In one aircraft, a fierce, silent debate raged in the cockpit. The pilot, his face etched with fatigue and concentration, stared at the unforgiving expanse of water below, then at the darkening, mountainous coastline ahead. His mind wrestled with the two terrible options laid out in their briefings. Ditching in the sea offered the slim chance of using the life raft, of staying together as a crew. but the ocean was a freezing, merciless grave. A single mistake in the landing could tear the plane apart on impact, trapping them all inside a sinking aluminum coffin. The alternative was to climb for altitude, to gain enough height for a parachute jump. That meant bailing out into the pitch-black unknown, separating the crew, scattering them across a foreign landscape that could be friendly, hostile, or simply impassable. It was a choice between a collective gamble with the sea or individual gambles with the land, and the weight of that decision for his men pressed down on him like a physical force. He looked at his co-pilot, at the navigator, craning his neck from his station, and saw the same unspoken question in their eyes. They were waiting for his call, their lives hanging on his judgment. The reality of their situation, the no way home that had been an abstract concept in a San Francisco hangar, now settled over the crew with the crushing weight of absolute truth. There would be no warm meal, no debriefing, no return to the familiar rhythm of base life. The world had shrunk to the confines of their shuddering plane, and the few minutes of flight it had left. Each man was alone with his thoughts, the bravado of the volunteer stripped away to reveal the core of a man facing his mortality. They checked their parachute harnesses for the 10th time, their fingers fumbling with the cold metal buckles. They tightened the straps on their life vests, the coarse Mae Wests suddenly feeling flimsy and inadequate. They stuffed what little they could into their pockets, a waterlogged map, a lucky coin, a photograph of a smiling face, tiny, pathetic talismans against the immense unknown. The mission was accomplished. Japan had been struck, but as the first engine coughed, sputtered, and fell silent, the hollow, windmilling sound of the propeller was a brutal confirmation. They were no longer raiders. They were survivors, and their real ordeal was just about to begin. Darkness fell with the swift, final curtain of the tropics, swallowing the last traces of twilight and plunging the world into an inky, featureless void. The final, sputtering coughs of the B-25's engines had given way to an eerie, wind-whistling silence. The great bombers now just gliding ghosts in the night. The order, when it came, was a terse, static-laced crackle over the interphone. A single word that severed their last tie to the familiar. Bail out. There was no time for ceremony. No final words of encouragement. It was a command of pure necessity. A leap of faith into the abyss. One by one, the crew members shuffled toward the aft hatch, their movements stiff with cold and fear. Each man a solitary figure poised on the threshold between the dying machine and the infinite, black unknown. The first man out was swallowed by the night instantly, his form vanishing the moment he cleared the fuselage. Then came the sudden, violent, life-saving jerk of the parachute, deploying, a white blossom of silk, miraculously blooming in the darkness. One after another, the crews followed, tumbling into the rushing cold, their stomachs lurching as they fell. The ripcord handle was a cold, hard promise in their grip. The yank of prayer answered by the reassuring shock of the canopy, snapping open, arresting their fall. With a force that stole their breath, they swung beneath the silken domes, suspended in a world of utter blackness. The only sounds, the sigh of the wind in the shroud lines, and the frantic hammering of their own hearts. Below them, there was nothing. No lights, no landmarks, just a deep, impenetrable gloom that hinted at the jagged teeth of mountains and the dark quilt of forests. The landings were brutal, disorienting affairs. The ground rushed up unseen, a sudden, hard impact that drove the air from their lungs and sent jarring pains shooting through ankles and knees. Some slammed into rocky, unforgiving hillsides, their chutes snagging on stunted, gnarled trees, leaving them dangling helplessly until they could cut themselves free. Others crashed through the canopy of dense bamboo groves, the sharp, whipping branches tearing at their flight suits and skin before they thudded onto damp, leaf-littered earth. One man landed squarely in a flooded rice paddy, the cold, thick mud swallowing him to his waist, the stench of decay and fertilizer filling his nostrils as he struggled to free himself from his harness. For long minutes, each man lay where he fell, gasping, listening to the profound silence of the countryside, utterly alone and completely lost. The world had shrunk to the few feet of ground they could feel beneath their trembling hands. It was from this profound isolation that the first hints of rescue emerged. A flickering, orange light bobbed in the distance, moving slowly through the paddy fields. Then another, and another, a constellation of lanterns, carried by shadowy figures. The American airmen, their hands on their .45 pistols, watched with a mixture of hope and terror as the figures drew nearer. They were Chinese peasants, their faces weathered and curious in the lantern light, dressed in simple dark blue tunics and wide-brimmed hats. They showed no aggression, only a cautious wonder. One old man, his back bent with a lifetime of labor, approached a pilot who was tangled in his parachute lines. He did not speak, but his gnarled hands were gentle as he helped cut the cords. He pointed to the sky, then to the American, and gave a slow, deliberate nod. Another group of farmers found a navigator shivering by a stream. They offered him a gourd of water, their eyes wide at his strange uniform and pale face. There were no shared words, only gestures, a hand extended, a bowl offered, a pointing finger indicating a path away from the open fields. In those first silent encounters in the gentle, curious eyes of the peasants, the downed airmen saw not an enemy, but the faint, glowing ember of potential rescue, a fragile thread of humanity in the vast, dark tapestry of a foreign land. The ground rushed up to meet them with the brutal, unforgiving speed of a hammer blow. Ted Lawson's B-25, its engine starved into silence, was a dead weight falling from the sky. The dark patch of earth he had aimed for in the moonlight was not a field, but a flooded rice paddy, its surface a deceptively smooth mirror reflecting the indifferent stars. The impact was a cataclysm of screaming metal and geysers of foul-smelling water. The nose dug in first, plowing a deep furrow through the thick, sucking mud, the force of the deceleration slamming every man forward against his harness with bone-jarring violence. The main landing gear sheared off with a sound like a gunshot, and the fuselage, its back broken, skidded and twisted sideways before coming to a final groaning rest, tilted at a steep angle in the mire. For a moment there was only silence, deeper than the flight had ever been, broken by the slow drip of water and the hiss of hot metal cooling. Then the pain began, a bright, insistent flare in the darkness. Lawson himself felt a white-hot agony lance through his leg, pinned and twisted beneath the crumpled instrument panel. Next to him, his co-pilot groaned, clutching a shoulder that was already swelling and purpling. In the navigator's compartment, a low, pained moan indicated another injury. The smell was a nauseating cocktail of high-octane fuel, damp earth, and the coppery tang of fresh blood. They had to move, and quickly. The crash had been anything but stealthy. The sound would have carried for miles in the quiet countryside, a beacon for any Japanese patrol in the area. Fear of capture was a more potent stimulant than any adrenaline. With gritted teeth and muffled curses, they began the frantic, painful scramble to escape the wreckage. Lawson had to use his knife to cut part of his flight suit away from the mangled metal trapping his leg, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. They dragged themselves through the shattered cockpit windows and the torn open fuselage, collapsing into the knee-deep, icy water of the paddy, their breaths coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. They had barely found their footing in the sucking mud when shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness of the dikes and tree lines. Figures emerged, not with the rigid posture of soldiers, but with the cautious, hunched gait of farmers. They were Chinese peasants, their faces lined and leathery, their hands calloused and strong. They carried no weapons, only lanterns that cast a weak, swinging light over the horrific scene. For a long moment, the two groups simply stared at each other across a chasm of language, culture, and circumstance. The American airmen, bleeding and broken beside their mangled machine of war, and the local farmers whose world had just fallen from the sky. Then, without a word, the farmers moved. They waded into the paddy, their movements sure and steady in the familiar terrain. Gentle but firm hands took hold of the injured men, supporting their weight, helping them clamber up the slippery earthen dike and away from the wreck. One old man, his back bent but his eyes sharp, knelt beside Lawson, examining his leg with a practiced, sorrowful gaze. He produced a long strip of rough homespun cloth from his tunic, and, with surprising deftness, began to fashion a makeshift splint, using a piece of bamboo from the paddy's edge. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his focus absolute. Another farmer offered a gourd of water to the co-pilot, supporting his head as he drank. There were no shared words, no explanations. The only sounds were the labored breathing of the injured, the squelch of mud, and the soft, rhythmic chirping of the night insects that had already reclaimed their domain. In those moments of shared pain and quiet assistance, the raid's abstract, strategic purpose fell away, leaving only its raw physical toll and the profound, wordless solidarity of one human being helping another. The farmers, at great risk to themselves, were not seeing enemies or instruments of war. They were seeing wounded men, and in that simple, humane recognition, they offered the first, fragile hope of survival amidst the wreckage. The darkness became a shroud for their escape, the moon, a fickle ally, ducking behind scudding clouds as the small band of survivors began their painful, halting trek away from the wreckage. Guided by the silent, determined farmers, they moved like ghosts through the Chinese countryside, a landscape of shadowy, terraced hills and whispering bamboo groves. Every sound was a potential threat, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of the night wind in the leaves, the crunch of their own boots on the gravel path. They were intruders in a land at war, and the ever-present fear of Japanese patrols was a cold stone in each man's gut, a constant companion to the throbbing ache of their injuries. They stuck to narrow, ancient footpaths that wound through the hills, avoiding the wider roads where the rumble of truck engines or the clatter of boot heels could mean capture or death. The farmers, their faces grim and watchful in the faint light, moved with an innate knowledge of the land, pausing frequently to listen, their hands raised in silent warning at any unfamiliar noise. Dawn broke, a pale, watery light that revealed the immense scale of the challenge before them. The language barrier was a wall as formidable as any mountain range. Ted Lawson, leaning heavily on a crudely fashioned bamboo staff, would try to gesture toward his leg or point west, attempting to convey their need for a doctor or a route to the interior. The farmers would nod, their expressions kind but uncomprehending, and reply in a stream of soft musical syllables that meant nothing to the American airmen. Their attempts to ask for water, for food, for the direction to any organized Chinese forces were met with the same polite, frustrating confusion. Aid was offered, but it was clumsy, hampered by this fundamental divide. A farmer would press a cold, boiled sweet potato into a gunner's ham, a gesture of profound generosity, but could not answer the desperate, silent question in the airman's eyes. Are we safe? Where are we going? It was during a brief, hidden rest in a secluded hollow that the true nature of their aid was revealed. An old woman, her face an intricate map of wrinkles, emerged from a small hut seemingly carved into the hillside. She carried a steaming, blackened pot. With gentle, insistent hands, she ushered the exhausted and shivering men to sit. She began to ladle the thin, fragrant rice porridge into chipped ceramic bowls, handing one to each airman. The simple act of being given hot food, of feeling the warmth of the bowl seep into their cold, trembling hands, was a moment of profound, wordless communion. The crew of the Ruptured Duck, as Lawson had named his plane, sat in a ragged circle with the farmers who had saved them. They ate in silence, the only sounds the gentle slurping of the porridge and the morning song of hidden birds. There were no flags in that hollow, no politics, no grand strategy of war. There were only hungry men, and other men and women who shared the little they had. In that shared meal, the thematic hope in adversity burned with a quiet, steady flame. The porridge was meager, the future was terrifyingly uncertain, and the pain of their injuries was a constant, grinding reality. Yet, as Lawson looked around the circle, he saw not despair, but a stubborn, resilient humanity. He saw the old woman's eyes, bright with a kindness that needed no translation. He saw the farmer who had splintered his leg, patiently helping the co-pilot sip from a bowl. The raid had been an act of devastating violence, a firestorm delivered from the sky. But here, on the ground, in the simple act of breaking bread, or in this case, sharing rice amidst the terror and the pain, was its counterpoint, a testament to the unbreakable human impulse to aid, to shelter, and to hope, even when the world was crumbling into chaos around them. The long walk was far from over, but for a brief moment, with the warmth of the simple meal in their bellies and the silent, steadfast presence of their rescuers beside them, the path ahead seemed just a little less dark, the illusion of sanctuary shattered with the sharp, guttural cry of a foreign command. One moment, the three airmen were huddled in the musty darkness of a root cellar, their bodies pressed against sacks of millet, their ears straining for the comforting, receding footsteps of the Chinese family that had hidden them. The next, the wooden hatch was torn away, and the gray dawn light framed the silhouettes of steel helmets and the long, menacing barrels of Arisaka rifles. Japanese soldiers. Their faces were hard, impersonal masks of discipline and contempt. Rough hands dragged the Americans from their hiding place, shoving them into the muddy courtyard where other villagers stood frozen in fear. The sudden, brutal transition from hope to captivity was a physical blow, leaving them breathless and disoriented. The world had narrowed to the cold pressure of a bayonet at their backs, and the incomprehensible, angry shouts of their captors. The interrogation began, not in a formal room, but there, in the dirt. An officer, his uniform immaculate despite the rural setting, stepped forward. He did not shout. His voice was a low, controlled hiss, his English precise and chilling. He demanded their unit, their mission details, their point of origin. When met with stony silence, the first blow fell. A rifle butt slammed into the ribs of the youngest airman, the navigator. The sound was a sickening thud of wood and bone, followed by a choked gasp. The resilience of the prisoners was not born of heroics, but of a simple, desperate understanding. The information they held was the last weapon they possessed. To give it was to betray every other crew, to invalidate the risk taken by the Chinese who had helped them. They clenched their jaws, their eyes fixed on some distant point, enduring the slaps, the kicks, the casual, brutal violence, with a silence that was itself a form of fall. Defiance. They were transported to a makeshift garrison, a commandeered schoolhouse that now stank of sweat, fear, and disinfectant. The scenes of brutality became more systematic, more refined in their cruelty. They were forced to stand for hours, their injured legs screaming in protest. Sleep was a phantom, snatched away by buckets of cold water or the jarring shock of a guard's boot. The interrogator's questions were a relentless, monotonous drill. His patience, a terrifying thing. He would sit sipping tea while his subordinates worked, his eyes noting every flinch, every tremor. One gunner, his face swollen and bloody, was subjected to a mock execution. The cold muzzle of a pistol pressed to his temple for what felt like an eternity. The click of the empty chamber, a sound that would haunt him forever. Through it all, the prisoners showed a resilience that was less about courage and more about a deep, animal stubbornness. They retreated inward, to memories of home, to the faces of their crewmates, to the roaring triumph of their takeoff from the Hornet. Their silent defiance was in the way they refused to meet their tormentor's gaze, in the way they helped each other to their feet after a beating, in the way they shared a sip of water from a single grimy cup when the guards weren't looking. The duress was a fire that burned away everything but the core of their being. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic reveals. Their resistance was etched in the set of a bruised jaw, in the quiet, steady breathing of a man forcing his body not to tremble, in the almost imperceptible shake of a head when offered food in exchange for information. It was a battle fought in the smallest of gestures, a war of wills waged in a squalid room under a single bare light bulb. The Japanese sought to break them, to reduce them to compliant, broken animals. But in the face of the brutality, the prisoners found a strange, grim power in their shared ordeal. They were no longer just airmen. They were a secret collectively held, and their silent, collective defiance became a fortress that their captors, for all their violence, could not quite breach. In the mist-shrouded hills and flooded valleys of eastern China, a different kind of war was being waged, a silent, shadowy campaign of salvation conducted by those who had nothing to give but their courage. Word of the fallen American airmen spread through the countryside, not by radio, but through a clandestine network of whispers, passed from village to village by partisans who moved like ghosts through the Japanese lines. These resistance fighters, their faces hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, coordinated with a handful of brave missionaries who had refused to evacuate, their faith now manifesting in acts of profound earthly courage. Together, they formed a fragile, human chain dedicated to one purpose: guiding the scattered crews to safety. They used ancient footpaths and hidden river fords, their knowledge of the land their greatest weapon against the occupying forces that scoured the countryside. A flickering lantern in a window, a specific arrangement of stones on a path. A herdsman's seemingly idle whistle, these were the signals that marked the way. A trail of breadcrumbs through a forest of danger, leading the dazed and injured airmen toward the promise of freedom. It was in a small, rain-swept village tucked into a fold of the mountains that Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle was found. He had spent a cold, solitary night huddled in a grove of bamboo, the weight of command now replaced by the heavier burden of perceived failure. He had led them all here, to this. When the partisan scouts found him, his uniform was torn, his face gaunt with exhaustion, and a deep, gnawing grief. The men who greeted him were not a formal military reception, but a band of ragged farmers, armed with aged rifles and an unshakable resolve. They brought him to a hidden cave, where a small pot of tea steamed over a carefully shielded fire. As he warmed his hands, Doolittle's mind turned inward, reflecting on the losses he was sure had been sustained. He saw the faces of his men, the young gunners, the steady navigators, the pilots who had trusted him to lead them. He thought of the empty gauges, the blackness of the bailout, the certain capture of some. The success of the raid felt hollow, a distant, theoretical victory overshadowed by the immediate, crushing reality of men scattered, injured or lost. The weight of each missing man settled on his shoulders, a commander's private torment amidst the quiet kindness of his rescuers. All across the region, acts of breathtaking bravery from the local population emphasized the profound human alliance that transcended language and culture. In one village, when a Japanese patrol began a house-to-house search, an elderly grandmother, without a moment's hesitation, pushed 2 American airmen into her own bed, pulling the quilts up to their chins and shooing her own grandchildren into a corner. She then sat at the bedside, fanning the faces of the terrified, wide-eyed men and chiding the confused Japanese soldiers for disturbing her sick sons. The ruse, carried out with stunning composure, saved their lives. In another instance, a group of partisans deliberately led a Japanese platoon on a wild goose chase through the mountains, drawing them away from a valley where a downed crew was being sheltered, an act of diversion that risked their own annihilation for the sake of strangers. A missionary doctor working by candlelight in a converted temple performed a desperate field amputation on a gunner's shattered leg, using tools sterilized in boiling water and a prayer, his calm hands a stark contrast to the storm of war outside. These were not strategic decisions. They were moral ones. Each bowl of rice given, each hidden path revealed. Each lie told to an enemy soldier was a stitch in the fabric of a shared humanity. Defiant affirmation that compassion could persist, even in the heart of conflict. The alliance between the American raiders and the Chinese people was being forged not in conference rooms, but in the damp, dark places of the earth, sealed with silent gratitude and immeasurable courage. The news arrived, not in an official dispatch, but in broken whispers and fragmented reports carried by haggard partisans and grim-faced missionaries who emerged from the Japanese-held territories. It seeped into the makeshift camps where the rescued airmen gathered, a cold, creeping poison that tainted the relief of their own survival. The stories were stark and unadorned, of 3 crew members from one plane, captured after their bailout, subjected to a swift, brutal show trial, and executed by firing squad as war criminals, of others from different bombers, now languishing in squalid prison camps, their fate a terrifying question mark. Names that had been called during roll calls on the Hornet were now spoken in hushed, horrified tones, their owners transformed from comrades into martyrs and prisoners. The euphoria of having struck Japan curdled into a heavy, suffocating dread. The raid had been a success, but its price was now being counted in broken bodies and extinguished lives. Jimmy Doolittle received the confirmation in a small, lamplit room. The partisan leader's quiet words, landing with the force of physical blows. He stood by a rough-hewn table, his hands usually so steady, gripping the edge until his knuckles were white. The faces of the executed men flashed in his mind. Young faces, some barely out of their teens who had trusted his leadership implicitly. He saw them on the Hornet's deck, their expressions a mix of fear and determination. He had told them the mission was worth the risk, that the blow to Japanese morale and the boost to American spirit would justify the sacrifice. Now, confronted with the cold, hard fact of that sacrifice, the strategic calculus felt like a monstrous abstraction. A profound, gut-wrenching guilt settled over him, a leaden cloak he felt he would never shed. He was their commander. He had brought them to this. The success of the bombing runs, the fires over Tokyo, all of it seemed to pale against the image of 3 graves in a foreign field. He had led 80 men into the sky, and he would have to return home, knowing he could not bring them all back. Among the other survivors, a different kind of mourning took hold, a quiet, communal grief that permeated their temporary sanctuary. Men who had laughed together during the long sea voyage now sat in silence, staring at the ground. They mourned not just the lost, but their own innocence. The audacious adventure was over, stripped away to reveal war's true, brutal face. They saw the empty spaces where their friends should have been, heard the silence where their voices should have been. Some wept openly, their shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Others internalized the pain, their faces becoming hard, impassive masks, their eyes holding a new, haunted depth. They replayed the final moments before the bailout, the chaotic landings, wondering if there was anything they could have done, any different choice that might have altered the fates of their captured and executed comrades. The camaraderie that had been their strength now became the vessel for their shared sorrow. A burden carried collectively but felt with the acute sting of individual loss. The unspoken, thematic question hung in the air, as palpable as the mountain mist outside their hideout. Had it been worth the cost? Was the symbolic victory, the psychological blow against Japan, the boost to American morale, worth the lives of those men? Was it worth the broken bodies of the injured, like Ted Lawson fighting for his life in a missionary clinic, or the shattered spirits of those now facing years of imprisonment and torture? There were no easy answers, only the grim ledger of war. On one side, the fires of Tokyo and a nation's pride rekindled. On the other, the specific, irreplaceable weight of individual lives extinguished and futures stolen. The raiders had become more than just pilots and crew. They were now a permanent part of this brutal equation, their personal toll the dark, necessary ink with which the history of the war was being written. The victory was real, but its taste was ashen, and its price was a debt that would be carried in the hearts of the survivors, and most heavily of all, in the tormented soul of their leader for the rest of their days. The roar that greeted them was not of straining engines or bursting flak, but of a nation's collective heart bursting with pride. When the first of Doolittle's raiders stepped back onto American soil, they were met not as returning soldiers, but as living legends. Their faces, thinner and older than when they had departed from the Hornet's deck, were splashed across every newspaper, their names on every radio broadcast. Parades choked the streets of Washington, D.C. and other cities, a blizzard of ticker tape and waving flags obscuring the sun. The public, starved for a victory after the relentless gloom following Pearl Harbor, latched onto their story with a fervor that was almost religious. The Doolittle Raid was more than a military operation. It was a potent elixir for a wounded national spirit, a defiant proof that America could and would strike back, no matter the distance or the odds. The sight of these men, home against all probability, sent a jolt of electric morale through the country, transforming the abstract concept of the war effort into the tangible, grinning faces of heroes. But behind the public adulation, the personal reunions were steeped in a profound, bittersweet complexity. Wives and sweethearts rushed into the arms of returning airmen, their embraces tight and desperate, their tears a mixture of joy and the lingering terror of loss. The men they held, however, were not the same. Boys who had volunteered for a secret mission. They returned with a new stillness in their eyes, a distance that the cheering crowds could not breach. A pilot, holding his weeping wife, would find his mind flashing to the sight of a Japanese Zero spiraling into the flames of Tokyo, or the feel of a Chinese farmer's calloused hand helping him to his feet. A gunner, tousling his son's hair, would be momentarily deafened by the memory of his own .50 calibers chattering into the void. The warmth of home was real, but it had to penetrate a layer of ice formed over the East China Sea, and in the cold, dark hold of the Japanese prison cell. Their smiles for the cameras were genuine, but they did not always reach their eyes, which had seen too much. The press conferences were a theater of symbolism, a carefully staged narrative of American audacity and resolve. Doolittle stood before a forest of microphones, his uniform crisp, his demeanor composed, the very picture of the unflappable leader. He spoke of the crew's skill and bravery, of the flawless execution of the takeoff, of the successful strike against the enemy's heart. He deflected questions about the fates of the missing and captured, his voice tightening almost imperceptibly. The reporters scribbled furiously, crafting the myth of the raid, focusing on the bombs over Tokyo, not the empty seats at the mess tables back at the base. The raid was framed as a masterstroke, a psychological victory that had humbled the enemy and rallied the Allies. The deeper, more complicated truths, the terror of the bailout, the agony of the injured, the guilt of the commander were left in the quiet rooms, away from the flashbulbs and the cheering. In those quiet rooms, away from the public days, the character moments of trauma and pride played out in stark relief. One navigator, hailed as a hero at a formal dinner, excused himself abruptly and was found minutes later in a lavatory, trembling, the sound of a backfiring car having sent him spiraling back into the flak-filled skies over Yokohama. A bombardier, awarded a medal, would sit for hours staring at the ribbon in its case, his pride warring with the indelible memory of the fires spreading through a city of millions. Yet, alongside the trauma, there was an undeniable, fierce pride. They had done it. They had done what was said to be impossible. They had flown a land-based bomber off a carrier, navigated a vast ocean to strike a powerful enemy in his own capital, and through a combination of skill, luck, and the incredible courage of strangers, some of them had made it home. The two forces, the searing trauma of their ordeal and the fierce pride in their accomplishment coexisted within them, forever intertwined. They were heroes. Yes, celebrated and cheered, but they were also men forever marked by the long, dark flight from the Hornet, a journey that had not ended when their feet touched American soil, but had simply taken on a new, more private and complex course. The bombs that fell on Tokyo and its sister cities did more than shatter steel and ignite firestorms. They sent a seismic tremor through the very foundations of Imperial Japan's military strategy. The myth of the home island's inviolability, a cornerstone of national propaganda and military confidence, lay in smoking ruins. The High Command, humiliated and enraged, was forced into a frantic, costly reassessment. The war, which had been an offensive juggernaut pushing ever outward across the Pacific, now demanded a defensive pivot inward. Precious fighter squadrons, seasoned from the conquests in Malaya and the Philippines, were pulled back from the front lines and repositioned around key Japanese cities. Anti-aircraft batteries, once sparse, now bristled from the rooftops of Tokyo and Osaka in a dense, paranoid thicket. The nation's industrial output, already straining, was further diverted to bolster homeland air defense, a massive diversion of resources that siphoned strength from the Empire's far-flung offensive capabilities. The Doolittle Raid, a pinprick in terms of physical damage, became a strategic hemorrhage, forcing Japan to bleed strength into a defensive posture it had never believed it would need. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, the ripple effect was felt as a tidal wave of rejuvenating morale. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, a pall of shock and uncertainty had settled over the Allied forces. The Japanese military seemed unstoppable, an inexorable tide of victory. Then came the news, carefully released and brilliantly amplified by American propaganda. American bombers had struck the heart of Japan itself. On aircraft carriers patrolling the Coral Sea, in muddy dugouts on Bataan, and in the war rooms of London and Washington, the effect was electric. The raid was a psychological counterpunch of incalculable value. It proved the Japanese were not 10 feet tall. They could be reached, they could be hit, they could be made to feel the sting of war in their own sacred spaces. For every soldier, sailor, and marine who had faced the relentless advance of the rising sun, the Doolittle Raid was a validation, a proof that the enemy was vulnerable and that the long, hard road back had begun. It was a spark that ignited a fierce new determination. The historical context of the raid's strategic impact stretched far beyond the immediate shuffling of Japanese assets or the boost to Allied spirits. It directly influenced one of the war's most critical turning points. The humiliation of the attack fueled a burning desire for revenge within the Japanese naval command, a desire that clouded strategic judgment. Eager to draw the American fleet into a decisive, annihilating battle, and to extend their defensive perimeter, Japanese admirals conceived Operation MI, an ambitious plan to seize the tiny strategic outpost of Midway Atoll. This aggressive overreach, born from the sting of Doolittle's audacity, played directly into American hands. U.S. intelligence, having broken Japanese codes, was waiting. The resulting Battle of Midway in June 1942 became the graveyard of Japanese naval air power, a catastrophic defeat from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never fully recover. The 16 B-25s that had roared off the Hornet's deck had, in a very real sense, helped set the stage for this pivotal victory. Their bombs had not only burned warehouses in Tokyo, but had also lit a fuse of strategic miscalculation that would ultimately cripple the enemy's ability to wage an offensive war, altering the entire trajectory of the conflict in the Pacific and sending ripples of consequence that would wash all the way to the shores of Japan's final surrender. Years later, the roar of the engines had faded to a memory, but the echo of their audacity remained, a permanent vibration in the soul of the man who had led them, James Doolittle. His hair now silvered, his step a little slower, would sometimes find himself standing on a quiet airfield, the scent of high-octane fuel and damp earth triggering a cascade of images. He saw not the parades or the medals, but the faces of young men in a San Francisco hangar, their eyes wide with the terrifying truth of a one-way mission. He saw the heaving deck of the Hornet, a short, slick ribbon of steel against an endless gray sea. He felt the gut-wrenching lurch as his own plane clawed for altitude, and the cold, sobering dread that followed as they turned toward Japan, their fuel gauges already telling a story of impossible margins. The raid had been a masterpiece of daring, a feat that would be studied for generations. But in the quiet of his reflection, Doolittle understood its true legacy was not in the careful planning, but in the sheer, breathtaking audacity that had overshadowed it. That audacity became a ghost that haunted future war rooms and flight decks. The Doolittle Raid was dissected, analyzed, and ultimately enshrined as a new paradigm for the possible. It proved that the enemy's homeland was not a sanctuary, that perceived limitations were merely invitations for innovation. The very concept of strategic bombing was irrevocably altered. The long-range, carrier-based strike became a permanent fixture in the arsenal of modern warfare. Younger pilots who had been boys during the raid now spoke of it with irreverent awe. Its story a foundational myth of their own service. They flew newer, faster planes with greater range and destructive power. But the spirit that guided them, the willingness to attempt the improbable, to trade safety for a decisive psychological blow, was the same spirit that had launched 16 overloaded B-25s into a gale. The mission's true success was not just the fires it lit over Tokyo, but the countless future operations it inspired, the unspoken challenge it issued to every commander who followed. Have the courage to be audacious. For Doolittle, the meditation always returned to courage, not as an abstract virtue, but as a tangible force he had witnessed in the faces of 80 men. It was not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. He remembered the quiet resolve in Ted Lawson's eyes as he prepared for his own takeoff, the steady hands of the bombardiers as they lined up their sights over a waking city, the grim silence of the captured crews facing their interrogators. He thought of the Chinese farmers who risked everything for strangers, their courage a different but no less potent alloy of the same metal. They had all stared into the face of impossible odds. The vast ocean, the enemy defenses, the dwindling fuel, the certain capture, and had not looked away. Their courage was a collective, compounding energy, each man's resolve strengthening the next's, creating a whole far greater than the sum of its parts. It was a force that could, for a fleeting, glorious moment, bend the very laws of probability. In the end, the legacy of the raid was etched, not in the strategic shifts it forced or the morale it bolstered, but in this timeless meditation on the human capacity for courage. It was a story that would be told and retold, not for the details of the bombing runs or the technical specifications of the B-25, but for its core truth that when faced with a chasm of impossibility, the human spirit, fueled by audacity and bound by shared purpose, could find a way to build a bridge across it. The echo of their mission would never fade, a perpetual reminder that the most formidable enemy is often not the one across the battlefield, but the voice of doubt within, and that the greatest victories are sometimes won not by those who have the best chance of success, but by those who possess the sheer, unyielding courage to try when all odds say they will fail.